Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Welcome. My name is Sarah Altschuler. I'm an associate professor of English here at Northeastern. And I'm extremely pleased to welcome you also as the Associate Director of the Humanities Center and the Director of our Health, Humanities, and Society minor and initiative. Before we get to the reason that you all came today, I wanted to begin by telling you a little bit about the project that has really spawned this panel. It's part of an NEH grant that we received last spring. It's the National Endowment for the Humanities to begin curricular work to develop a digital curriculum for our Health, Humanities, and Society minor. We're particularly excited to undertake this work now as the COVID pandemic has made it clear that shifts toward data and digital health will play a significant role in the future of health and healthcare. This work seems especially important now more than ever, obviously also quite unfortunately, but we think it's a really also a useful opportunity to rethink some of these questions. While the information and technology revolution currently transforming healthcare presents exciting opportunities for increased quality of care, there are numerous social and cultural ramifications of this shift that, if under considered, have the potential to do great damage. We believe curricula need to be adapted to empower students both to thrive in the data-heavy medicine of the future and to be responsive to issues that include inadequately regulated privacy, the histories of abuse in medical data gathering, and the ways data representation shape how patients and healthcare workers alike think about health. We must likewise prepare them to consider the significant ethical challenges that emerge from rapid information and technology changes as they occur, rather than waiting until damage has been done, as the law works to catch up after the fact. In short, we need to train our future leaders in health data in the ways of thinking cultivated by the humanities and also the social sciences, so that they may be alert to the social and cultural aspects of these enormous shifts. And I just wanted to say that the reason, we really think that health humanities is an ideal place to undertake this work, but the field has been thus far coming out of its kind of history as the quote unquote medical humanities, very focused on the clinical encounter, which is to say using humanities and social science, well, mostly humanities tools and the arts to think about promoting things like empathy in doctors and preventing physician burnout. So our program already takes a much more analytical approach to the humanities, what the humanities and social sciences train, which is to say that we emphasize ways of knowing rather than ways of feeling. And we're really delighted to invite you to participate today in our efforts to collaboratively imagine the future of digital and health data, of a digital and data health humanities together. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Associate Professor Chris Parsons.
Hi, everybody. I also want to just thank everyone for overcoming whatever Zoom fatigue you might all have to join us this Friday afternoon for a conversation I'm really excited about. As Sarah Altschuler said, this is part of a longer conversation we're having at the Humanities Center and in our College of Social Science and Humanities about what the humanities and social sciences can add to these conversations about the increasingly digital features of health. I can't actually think of a group of people I'd rather have come together to talk these things through. I'll introduce each of the folks who are going to be speaking with us today right now before turning it over to them. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking to us briefly before we can get into our conversation. The first, who some of you might recognize, is Dan Cohen, who is Vice Provost for Information Collaboration, Dean of the Libraries, and Professor of History here at Northeastern. Prior to coming to Northeastern, he was the founding executive director of the Digital Public Library of America, which brought together the riches of America's libraries, archives, and museums, and made them freely available to the world. Before working at the DPLA, Dan was a professor of history in the Department of History and Art History at George Mason University and the director of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and Media. There, he oversaw projects ranging from Press Forward to the September 11 Digital Archive to the popular Zotero research tool. He's also a historian with interest in the history of mathematics, and he's focused in particular on how mathematics and their histories have intersected with histories of religion and society in the Victorian era. Following this is Joanna Radin, who is joining us from Yale, where she is a associate professor of history and of medicine with affiliations in history, anthropology, American studies, ethnicity, race and migration, and religion and modernity. She received her PhD in the history and sociology of science at Penn, and much of her so far has focused on the histories of the collection, preservation, use, and misuse of medical samples, medical data gathered from indigenous peoples. And all this came together in a series of wonderful articles in her 2017 book, Life on Ice, A History of New Uses for Cold Blood, published by the University of Chicago Press. She's now working, as she just mentioned to us, on a project on Michael Crichton, the author's influence on the history of science and medicine. And finally, the speaker who I'm going to promise myself and him not to refer to him just as other Dan, is Dan Bouk, who is Associate Professor of History and University Studies at Colgate, where he studies, and I want to quote this because I love how he said this, bureaucracy's quantification and other modern things shrouded in cloaks of boringness. In a number of articles in 2015, How Our Days Became Numbered, Risk and the Rise of the Statistical Individual, also published by the University of Chicago Press, he has examined the rise of the insurance industry and the quantification of our everyday life. He's currently working on a history of the census in the 1940s. So we've asked each of these speakers to provide an overview of what they're working on right now and their own experiences of 2020 and how their own experiences have shaped how they think about their work and this topic about digital history and the history of data in our present moment. So I'll turn it over right now to Professor Dan Cohen, or Dean Dan Cohen.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's great to be here, and I'm going to actually call myself the other Dan. So I will relieve Dan of that name, and I'm just delighted to be here. Chris sort of asked me to just provide an overview, and I think to put the topic for today in perspective, especially from the perspective of digital humanities, which I've worked in for a couple of decades, and thinking about the data histories of health. I sort of immediately thought back to a project that Chris mentioned in my bio, which is that I was one of the participants in putting together the September 11th Digital Archive 2 decades ago. It's amazing to think that it's almost 20 years ago now, with colleagues at George Mason and then also at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And we created this digital archive a few months after 9/11 happened. And this was, of course, before Instagram or Facebook or any of these sort of online self-documenting apps or websites. But we created a website to gather the sort of digital history of this major American event, in fact, a global event. And the 9/11 archive was very successful. It gathered 150,000 digital objects from about 30 or 40,000 people. Afterwards, and sort of reflecting on the archive, one of the things that really struck us at the Center for History and New Media was that not only have we gathered a lot of data and files about 9/11, but looking through them, we realized that it was the first major event that was experienced by large numbers of people as a cell phone event. 25% of the stories that we gathered involved someone calling someone else on a cell phone, which, again, to put this in perspective, 20 years ago was a relatively new thing. We actually gathered photos from cell phones. This is pre-iPhone, 6 years before the iPhone. People had really lousy cameras on their first cell phones, but people took very grainy photos that they uploaded to our site. We gathered BlackBerry communications, again, a major historical event that was documented in digital voicemail, in BlackBerry, in text, in email. All of these technologies were sort of embedded there in this archive, which in 2 years after the event on 9/11, 2003, we donated to the Library of Congress as their first major digital acquisition, this sort of strange new born digital archive of the event. But reflecting back on it, it really was important that this was an event that was sort of documented in new ways because of a device that so many people carried on them, whether it was a BlackBerry or a flip phone that had a small camera on it. When I look at 2020, obviously there are more important stories to 2020 than just the history of technology. But I do think that an important first take on 2020 is that COVID and what we're seeing this year is probably the first big data historical event. We have so much more data about what happened in 2020 than we do about 9/11. I mean, 150,000 digital objects is tiny compared to what we will have for a future historian to be able to do research on 2020. And you can just think about, and I think it's worth getting the sort of gears moving in your brain. Think about that future historian who looks back at 2020 and what she will have if we preserve it. Another topic perhaps for later in the hour. But, we have incredible projects like the COVID-19 tracking project, non-governmental, really reporter-based project to gather statistical information about infections and deaths and hospitalizations. Tremendous open data set that you can burrow down to the county level in. Our friends here at George Mason, the Boston Area Research Institute, gathered data over 2020 on things like ads in Craigslist and put those all together in searchable data sets. So you can look at what furniture people were getting rid of. There will be a future dissertation on the rise of the standing desk in 2020 because you can already see patterns of acquisition around working from home that are, again, discernible from that. Dan O'Brien, who runs BARI, wrote a great book called The Urban Commons, has been collecting calls to 311 in Boston, the information site. So we'll have data about who called 311. What were they calling about? Were they calling about a neighbor who refused to put a mask on? All of these things have metadata attached to them as well. Then there's the darker data that may or may not be available in the future when we think about 2020. Most weather apps that are on your phone have embedded frameworks from third parties that track your movements. And in fact, a lot of the public health guidance has been based upon this sort of anonymized tracking data where literally individual movements have been aggregated, mapped, and associated with health in the present and health outcomes. We may get contact tracing data at some point in the future if they move from a dark archive, sits in Epic hospital systems that might become saved and brought to light in the future, which will allow us to understand who met with whom, who got COVID, who didn't, what were their social patterns. So as I stand back and think about 2020, I sort of think that, again, this is a remarkable moment in sort of our data history. It's related to a health event, but it is going to enlighten us in the ways that everything that we do has now become documented in all of these new ways, in the same way that 9/11 was documented by cell phones for the first time, a major event in American history. And as I think ahead, as Chris sort of asked me to do in terms of digital humanities, I think some of the most interesting work to come out of this will not be from just a single data set, but the interweaving of data from different domains. Can we take the Twitter archive and associate it with the health information in COVID-19 tracking? Can we take the 311 calls and relate it to some of the social movements? And of course, there'll be lots of other data that I haven't been able to talk about around Black Lives Matter and protests and the election. All of these things have been documented in entirely relatively new ways, right? And documented at such great extent that it will be decades, more than 2 decades to come, that it will take us to really sort through it, to scan through it, to analyze it, and to add it into the history that we already have. So I'm looking forward to Joanna and the real Dan speaking, and I know that they've got slides, so I'll hand it over to them.
All right, I might ask Joanna Radin to speak next.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. We do have some slides. Okay, can you see those slides? Okay, great. Well, I first just want to say thank you to Chris and Sari and for convening this conversation, and I'm really honored to be able to talk with both Dans. New Dan, I'm going to call Dan Cohen new Dan. He's new to me, and older Dan, not old Dan. To Dan Bouk, who I've been privileged to have, many conversations about these issues, and it's really perfect forum to be thinking through a lot of things that have been on my mind for a long time, and feel relevant in tragically new ways. So I sort of am trying to frame where I'm coming from, just to say a little bit more. I'm trained as a historian, but I'm based in a medical school, which has been a real privilege and opportunity to be thinking in a very concrete way about how medical history matters for all kinds of things, but in particular for our digital age. And something that Dan and I have talked about, Dan B and I have talked about a lot, is the way in which so much of the discourse and conversation about big data, there's been all kinds of hand waving, like we have to kind of reinvent this whole new mode. And what I think is very powerful is that, and this is the way I got into questions about data, is looking at material histories of collecting and collections in the life sciences for me, but all kinds of sciences, really can give us some object lessons about what to do and most importantly, what not to do when we think about data and ethics. And I think, as I move throughout the various paths that I've taken in my career, I oftentimes meet humanists for whom speaking about science and speaking about medicine isn't as common as it is for me. And they say, oh, when I talk about these kinds of challenges of emerging science and technology, say, oh, well, the bioethicists have that figured out. And what I'm really interested in, not just as a historian of medicine, but as a historian of bioethics itself, are some of the limitations and challenges that bioethics as a field has faced as they've attempted to address emerging life science, information science, technology, and medicine. And so when we hear data scientists say, we should just remodel our ethical conversations on bioethics, my answer is always like, no, this is an opportunity to look at what bioethics has taught us about what we might want to do and what we shouldn't do. And so that's just a way of opening up where I'm coming from and thinking about questions of reuse and responsibility of data, because I'm really interested in a way that articulates to what we just heard from Dan C. It's not just about the data existing, but there are all kinds of technical and ethical questions about what it means to use that data and what he referred to as the dark side. And I think there's actually an enormous amount, and I doubt he will disagree, of moral ambiguity that suffuses all of this, which is partly what makes it so complicated and necessary, I think, to have some clarity about what it is that we're actually trying to do when we engage with these issues. So I wanted to just sort of open with, I'll loop back around, start in 2020, loop back through sort of the Cold War, and then come back to 2020. But this was a story just from a couple days ago in the New York Times. And I want to draw your attention to the lead here. Blood samples recovered from patients suggest a powerful, long-lasting immune response, researchers reported. And so the question that's always on my mind is like, where were those blood samples recovered from? Like, what does it mean? What information is in these blood samples? How do body parts come to be seen as information generating resources for all kinds of purposes? And how should we think about it? And I think it's actually, there's a lot here that we could pick apart in this just one little screen grab. But it says here, blood was drawn for a COVID-19 antibody test at the University of Arizona in Tucson earlier this year. And we see there is, it looks like a woman with black skin having their blood drawn which raises certain questions about ownership of the body, whose bodies are knowledge about disease being built on, whose bodies are not being included, and is inclusion even the right framing to think about what's happening here. But also the question of University of Arizona in Tucson, we're going to come back to that in a minute. This site is really interesting. And so in this one sort of screen story among them, there's ones like this every day, we can see open up a lot of the big questions that I've been wrestling with about how medical history helps us to think about data ethics and what it means to think in terms of, not even data ethics, think in terms of data in the moral ambiguities of our COVID present. And so here we're going to go back to a field site for my research, which is a place in a basement in Binghamton, New York. Binghamton's a few hours north of New York City. SUNY Binghamton, it's part of the State University of New York system. And this is what sort of a tableau of what's called a serum archive. So in these freezers, these are -20 freezers, so not even cold enough to maintain the Pfizer vaccine, but -20, but maybe the Moderna vaccine, -20 freezers in this lab that contain tens of thousands of samples of blood collected from indigenous people, as well as their non-human commensal species that have go back to the late 1950s, when anthropologists started to recognize that they could use new techniques of molecular biology to answer all kinds of questions, everything from questions about human biological variation, the evolution of human origins, to questions of epidemiology. So actually some of the oldest specimens in this basement come from Iran, where there was an outbreak of rabies in the 1950s, and blood was collected to try to understand rabies. But there are all kinds of potential infectious agents in these blood samples, known and unknown. But what's interesting to me is that this isn't called a biobank. It's not called a tissue repository. It's called a serum archive. And you can see here that on this door, the sign here, it's funded in part by the NIH, database management, that what this really is a place for taking the materials that were collected in 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s that are in these freezers and repurposing them so that they can be made to tell new kinds of stories in our genomic and post-genomic age. And so these are master's students in the program of biomedical anthropology who learn how to identify these old blood samples and figure out what to do with them. And I think you can see parallels to like a certain kind of library science, saying we're going to take these journals and figure out what is the relevant information to be digitized. And of course, there's like the, social and cultural historians who get all up in arms that say, oh my gosh, they only saved the peer-reviewed content of the academic journals and they didn't save, the advertisements, which might actually tell us something about the cultures of practice in this time. And these are similar kinds of challenges that get faced in a serum archive, because you get questions of property and who owns these materials, and what should happen. So these questions of who owns the materials in the archive are one of the places that we might think about. Who owns this data? Who owns even the blood that is seen as the container of all kinds of data, kind of like palimpsest of data. And that makes me turn to another figure who is very influential and important, a human person, around the same time that these large-scale collections of blood are being made. And this is, of course, Henrietta Lacks, who was a Black woman living within driving distance of Johns Hopkins, whose cancer cells wound up becoming the source of the HeLa cell line, which has really transformed the way biomedicine has happened. And if you're familiar with the book, or even if you're not, you probably know that the story there is not about science, anti-science, science, good, dark. It's about the way in which a a Black woman's body winds up becoming a kind of crucible, a resource for transforming biomedicine, but her descendants remain disenfranchised from systems of healthcare. So this has been a kind of, Henrietta Lacks has become a kind of like key name for opening up these questions about responsible reuse and the limits of reuse and ownership and of the body. And here I tend to think about with freezers because I'm interested in them as a kind of archive or a kind of way of thinking about repositories of life and time, and looking at the narratives that travel along with this idea of preserving data. And what Dan C. was mentioning, sort of like, well, if this data gets preserved, like if we even have it, you know, to be able to use it, if we can recover it. And for life scientists, the freezer is, you know, is their archive and is their way of creating a space of research materials, and freezer companies have capitalized on that. And I just to direct your attention to the tagline here, Revco, which is kind of like to scientific refrigerators what Xerox is to photocopies or Kleenexes to tissues. They say the future, inside. So this idea that the freezer is this repository that contains all of molecular biology swirling out. And here we're meant to think of the promise, the possibility of what could happen by having access to this kind of health data. But what isn't recognized is that what also persists in these freezers and these data repositories are ethical questions and the ways in which, you know, time is scrambled when these materials are brought back to life or thawed for reuse. And here we wind up in Tucson, Arizona, where this was a screen cap, another screen cap from the New York Times, when members of an indigenous community who had consented to have their blood samples collected for part of studies about their very high rates of hypertension and diabetes were disturbed to find out that the materials that had persisted in the freezers were being used without their consent for other kinds of studies about the inheritance of genetics of alcoholism, but also stories about human migration that undermined potentially their claims to sovereignty in the land. And they sued Arizona State University for to get their materials back, and they were able to settle out of court. And this is members of the tribe coming to reclaim their ancestors who they viewed as having been caught in a form of incomplete death. So not the kind of swirling possibilities of molecular biology, but kind of being held hostage by science in ways that they didn't consent. And I think it's really important to point out here that, again, this isn't about anti-science, isn't about indigenous people saying, well, this is our religion and it's not science. Remember, they agreed to work with scientists. They were willing to give their materials because they recognized that they had serious health issues that they believed that biomedicine could provide answers to. Yet they never got answers. And even as their bodies continue to perform labor for various kinds of biomedical researchers. And I think this question of you know, alienation and invisible labor that's been happening with data goes straight to some of the points that you know, I know we're going to hear Dan B talk about, but also about the way that our bodies and our health data and our movements are being collected and tracked in the age of COVID. And this sort of Janus face of science, or this sort of double-edged dimension in which we hope these technologies will help make our health circumstances more legible. The question is to whom and at what cost and whose bodies. And one of the things that I'm just very interested in as a kind of historian that's focused both on research relationships, but also on biomedical infrastructure, is how we can understand by tracking how physical materials have moved through these infrastructures over time can help us to get a handle on the way that new kinds of claims for you know, data futures are dependent on these same kinds of infrastructures. So I just want to say this is the book. If you want to read more about freezers and frozen blood, please look here. And I just wanted to point to another scholar who has really helped shape my thinking about indigeneity and this nexus of indigeneity and medicine science studies is Kim Tallbear, who is on the faculty at University of Alberta, the Faculty of Native Studies. And what she's trying to do in this book is look similarly at not just the kind of promises of Native American DNA that people are going to be able to know like who they are or how they really belong to a tribe, but to understand who that knowledge is ultimately serving, and what would it mean to refuse? What would it mean to opt out? Which I think is another kind of critical concept for thinking about responsible data use and our engagements with these data cultures. So there's a lot more that I could say, but I just wanted to kind of put a few bullet points up here that might help us organize some of our conversation in looking not just as bioethics as an answer, but bioethics as an object of study that has a history that can help us. We can think about the limitations of informed consent, with the ways in which we're asked to click here and consent forever. What does it mean? I think I take a pause every time I have to accept cookies. What exactly am I accepting? And sometimes I'm impatient and I just want to get the information that I want. And so these are issues that we need to really think about, this informed consent as a technology of bioethics that both does and doesn't serve users and patients. We need to also think about compensation for participation. What does it mean for us to be kind of freely giving away our data exhaust, say in Facebook, but also in various kinds of studies? I'm working with a really brilliant medical student at Yale who was at a lab in Seattle right as COVID was breaking, and we are working together to try to figure out, we're all getting where there's all this fetishization of testing. We need to get tests, we need to get testing, but what happens to your sample after you've been tested? Where is that going, and why has no one even asked that question? And so we're trying to reconstruct, not necessarily to kind of show anything that is particularly dark, although I suspect if you dig far enough, you're going to find things that you don't like, but just to try to understand, what does it mean for us to embrace these systems of tracking into our lives, particularly in this age of big data, particularly in a time when our data has never been more valuable? What are the trade-offs that we're making? Are we even aware that our effort to have a kind of yes or no answer about do we have COVID or do we not is only the first set of questions that our sample might be used to answer. And that leads us to a reassessment of the kind of fundamental bioethical principles of autonomy and privacy. What does it mean to make a decision as an individual when, say, on a basic level, your DNA actually connects you to kin in many ways? Think about the Golden State Killer, who was identified through the ways in which 23andMe has made massive populational data sets widely available. And you might be taking a 23andMe test because you want to do something recreational, or you have a kind of like quasi, risk-averse interest in trying to anticipate what issues you might have, without thinking about what other connections you're making by making that choice. You're consenting for yourself, but you're implicating family members that you know, and maybe ones you don't even know. And I would just add, one of the things that got me on this whole research path was an interest in instances of non-paternity resulting from recreational genetic testing. In other words, finding out that your father isn't your father, that you're not related in the way that you thought you were, which is actually more common and than people have anticipated. And I can say a lot more about that. And then I just wanted to point to a study that Dan B knows well about the ways in which Indigenous peoples going back to the 50s and 60s have become a resource for big data more generally. So this is a study, another kind of deeper study being done by the NIH on high rates of diabetes and hypertension, particularly diabetes amongst members of a community known to science as Pima, but also called Akamela Odom. And this data, which was collected in 50s and 60s, non-genetic data, but basic kind of biometric data, winds up in a database for machine learning, for people who want to test algorithms. And this is what it would look like. This freely available data set, because it's funded by the NIH, taxpayer money, means it has to be made available, which means that data about Indigenous peoples and their health is being used for whatever purposes anyone, including corporations, want to use it for. And this data set, these are just the kinds of information that's in the data set. So you'll see it's not any like blood or anything per se, but things like number of times pregnant, which means that this is actually all women in this data set, and body mass index, age, and I won't kind of go through all that. But this data set, the reason I point to it, it's not just a random data set. This data set, which winds up early on becoming part of this database of data sets, this UCI machine learning database, becomes almost like a model organism, in that like scientists wind up using it for all kinds of questions in all kinds of ways. And it kind of, I'll skip over, and it becomes just a sort of like people learning how to use basic statistical software like R, are like, today this is a homework assignment. Today we're going to use this PIMA data set. And so we might ask the question of, how do people become so alienated from their data that they can wind up becoming this routine way of answering questions? And I guess I'll just, I'm sort of probably gone over time, but I'll just end with this question that I think connects to what Dan C. was saying about the ways in which our smartphones are, now collecting. We're not only collecting our biomaterials, but collecting our, coordinates. And what are we going to do there? And we see that this was a story that came out this spring. One of the first contract tracing apps violated its own privacy policy. So what we're dealing with here are really profound questions of trust. And we can't even really understand those trust questions if we don't understand the infrastructures that make these kinds of issues possible. So I'm going to end here because I'm really eager to hear what Dan B has to say, but look forward to more opportunity for Q&A.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm going to try and take over the screen share here in a minute. I want to thank you all for inviting me here. I also want to thank the folks who are coming here from wherever it is you're coming here. I saw in the little participants window quite a few of you who I think are probably Northeastern affiliated, but also quite a few of you who I feel confident are. Sorry, I got distracted there. When I would go into this mode, I always get distracted. Can people see me? Can they hear me? Is the chat thing saying you can't hear me? You can hear me. I think we're good. I saw a number of beloved colleagues and fellow scholars in the audience too, so I want to thank you all for showing up. I want to begin by saying that Joanna's article, Digital Natives, about which she was just talking a little bit, is, I think, the one article that everyone who does anything that has to do with databases should be forced to read, and maybe collections in general. So Digital Natives by Joanna Radin, go out right now, one-stop shopping, get there. I'm going to talk a little bit about situated knowledge today, so I'm just going to very briefly situate myself here. I'm speaking to you from northern Manhattan on the ancestral territory of Lenape land. I've got a couple dogs around who are pretty consistently barking at the folks next door who are renovating the apartments so they can raise the rent in my corporate-owned apartment building. My partner is an opera singer, and he's got a performance today, and his studio is right next to me, so you might hear some opera singing while I'm talking. And my child is in school, like about 5 feet away from me, and has music class soon, taught by a person from Stomp. So there's possible that there will be drum beating and stomping happening in the not too distant future. And this, I think, is like an important way of reminding ourselves what it's like to live and work in a pandemic. One of the puppies is, just to be clear, a pandemic puppy who has joined us just for the pandemic. So I want to talk today about something I'm going to call an imaginary digital humanities tool, a function called somewhere data. Right, the function is called somewhere, and then the data goes inside the function. I'm riffing here off Donna Haraway's notion of situated knowledge, which is an article premised on the rejection of an idea about objectivity and also an idea about data, that objective knowledge is knowledge which is achieved through a view from nowhere, that it is somehow achieved without the person who, or the machines or the things that captured it, having had a context or a specific perspective themselves. So I want to imagine this tool somewhere, this function, where if you can take any kind of data set and you plug it in, that it then performs a kind of feminist STS analysis for you, and it spits out some important ways of understanding not the nowhere from which it comes, but the somewhere from which that data comes. And so I've got a couple stories I want to use to try to tell that. So let's start by we're going to use the somewhere function on census tracts and blocks. All right, and so we plug it in there. This is an important tool to think about in terms of the pandemic times, because at least when you think about the United States, public health data, census tract and block information is crucial to the apparatus by which people understand modern public health systems. Basically, whenever you want to figure out a rate of any kind of disease or a rate of any kind of health incident, your denominator, the number of people there, is premised on a census tract or block count, at least in many of these situations. If not on the direct census tract or block count, then on a population estimate based on a census tract or block count. So this is a crucial tool for public health. And indeed, when we plug this into the function and we press go, we might get an article like this by Nancy Krieger, who's a public health person and who's also done some really interesting work on the history of public health in relationship to the census. And Krieger makes a really powerful point to her colleagues that public health people need to be concerned about the census, precisely because the census is and has been for a long time a tool of public health. This article's title suggests maybe not always for things that we would consider to be equitable, but has been long involved with this. But she ends with this, right, this bit, 2 census tracts and health equity. And that's the kind of the happy story, in a sense, is the story by which the construction of census tracts made it possible for us today to look at the economic and racial characteristics of certain tracts and try to trace those to try to show how inequities caused by racism, inequities caused by economic inequality lead to poor health outcomes and make people's lives more difficult. So that's a good and an important story that we can tell as we try to place the history of the census and tract block there. There's a problem with the analysis though, which just doesn't quite go far enough. In part because what it does is it accepts the views of the actors who constructed the census tract and block. Which is to say that when the census tracts and blocks were invented in the early 20th century, the people who invented them pitched their invention as a way of avoiding politics. So in particular, what they said is it doesn't make sense to premise our statistical data on things like wards or boroughs or other political geographies. We need to create a objective scientific geography. And we know from other scholars' work, Michelle Murphy's work, Khalil Muhammad's work at the Condemnation of Blackness, that this generation of social scientists who were doing and pitching objective social science work in the early 20th century often either implicitly or explicitly imbricated that work, wove that work into work that was also anti-immigrant and anti-Black. And indeed, if we just scratch a little bit on the story of the census tract and census block especially, we find out that the census block was originally defined and structured the way it was in a significant part because New York State Constitution drew lines to determine where it was that each congressional representative would be coming from, and drew lines for its state legislature based on the number of total citizens, excluding all immigrants. This will unfortunately sound very of the moment right now for people who are following debates in Congress and or the president, or people who are looking at what Missouri has just voted to do, which is to try to make this kind of thing possible as well. But so the census block was built partially to allow for the kinds of health outcomes and health analysis that could be traced over time, but also was shaped inevitably by the politics of New York State. Indeed, if we look a little bit further and look at some of the stuff that was published using tracked and block data by the people who invented it, we see that the kinds of things that they're interested in reporting point to that concern about immigration, for instance. In this case, this is looking at the percentage of foreign-born whites and their distribution throughout Manhattan. What's the story of this? Does it mean, is my point like that that we should rethink what the census is in terms of public health? I mean, maybe, but more, my point is that we can't say that the reason you get to health equity or an equitable anti-racist position or a position that's inclusive is by producing objectivity or an objective science and then letting the machine go at it as its own. The way we get to a point where Nancy Krieger can reasonably say that public health is working in towards health equity is because you have this system that's constructed, but then you also have the civil rights movement and you have political activities by folks who shift the larger frames, by people who changed the New York State Constitution in the late 60s, early 70s, somewhere around there, such that New York State now apportions based on total population, not just population of citizens. And it's that political work that gets you to health equity alongside the work of supposed objectivity. Objectivity alone will likely reinforce status quo, not for any reasonable. We have no reason to believe that it'll lead towards better outcomes. So the second somewhere I want to do, and this is my last somewhere, but it'll take just a minute, is this is following a little bit on Dan C's point. It's tempting to say, wow, we're seeing a lot of datafication out of COVID, and to some extent we certainly are. One way I was struck was that we're seeing all of these, just the language of flatten the curve. To hear so many ordinary people speaking in this argot of curves, it struck me as very strange, and I started thinking about that a lot. And we see it in something like this. This is a New York Times simulation that probably many of you played with or saw at one point, talking about how projections of the number of infections, number of deaths that would be caused by disease, and they're looking at how different interventions would cause changes to those curves. So let's use our somewhere function and try to like remove this from a view from nowhere and try to think about where it is that this kind of thinking about data, this kind of datafication comes from. And one place, before we even do that, maybe I'm going to run the function one more time first on a different set of data. What if we did a somewhere here on this? This is John Grant's list of deaths from the 17th century. And it's premised on the kind of collections of bills of mortality that were themselves premised on or were inspired by the plague. And so part of the point here is that I think epidemics have a long history of pushing towards datafication. And the question then becomes for us, what kind of datafication, right? And at one level, the rise of the table of data can be tied to the plague. And that's a story that if we press our function, we can see that and a whole bunch of other really important ways of seeing what happened in Jackie Werneman's book, Numbered Lives, which tells a significant part of the story. So that's what the function gives us in that situation. Let's go back. Let's do the somewhere function on these kinds of curves, these kinds of tables, these kinds of projections that we're seeing all around us. What do we get? One story, right? It's key to say that you always get multiple stories whenever you do a somewhere function. But here's one story that pops up for me as I look at that. This is a chart from Stanley Javin's Theory of Political Economy. This is a leading thinker in economics in the late 19th century. And you see he's got one curve, PR, and then he's got another curve, P prime, R prime. And you see, we're seeing like a movement of the curve, right, from one way to another, seeing how it changes, a series of intersections. And it's a way of thinking about, like, if one kind of curve changes, what implications does it have for a series of other variables? It should look like a similar kind of curve drawing as what we've been talking about. In the early 20th century, Irving Fisher adopted and adapted this style of drawing from economics. He was an economist and used it to think about public health data. So in this case, he's got that C, and then C prime is Massachusetts, these are life curves. So the more you move to the right, the longer people are living at each given age. The ages are running along the x-axis. And then you see C double prime and C triple prime, possible 1 and possible 2. So these are, for him, imagined futures where public health interventions have allowed people to live longer and longer. And then he uses this information to try to cost out how much money will be saved by society if people live longer, and uses that as a rhetorical intervention to say, like, we should spend more money on public health. And just to show you, this is Urian Fisher, again, using that same kind of line drawing B prime, B prime, B prime rhetoric, that rhetorical style, in this case, to talk about different forms of interventions here, borrowing and lending, and the way that they change income streams. The kind of point of this, right, is to say that we're seeing how an economic rhetoric and economic logic came to be infused in public health thinking in the early 20th century. Now, if we jump towards a more recent moment, this curve, some of you might be familiar with, this is from 2009, and this was produced by Christina Romer and Jared Bernstein. I think Romer is usually given most authorship for this, as a projection for what would happen if the Obama recovery plan was passed, and what would happen if it wasn't. There's lots of criticism for the curve, in part because, like, all of the peaks should be a lot higher than they are. The without recovery plan should have been a lot higher, and the with recovery plan ended up being a higher peak for unemployment rates. But for me, it strikes me as this is another way in which what we are seeing at this particular moment in the New York Times or Washington Post, in these very popular simulations, is how, again, in economic logic, here one that was used to think about how does a government intervention, how is it going to in the future affect some outcome, in this case unemployment, has been shifted and employed now to say, all right, so how does a government intervention, or how does certain kinds of public health interventions lead to a shift in curves in the future? And it's, again, a similar sort of rhetoric. And I think we can tie a kind of straight line through visual analysis and through some archival work to that way in which public health has been infused with these economic logics and rhetorics. So if we're trying to figure out, like, what kind of datafication is being amplified by COVID, I think this is one place to point, alongside the larger kind of push towards big data that Dan Cohen was speaking about earlier. And the final thing I'll say just on this point, well, this rhetoric of tying economics to public health has been effective in lots of ways. It has significant drawbacks, one being that it values lives only so far as those lives are viewed to be economically valuable, which is not by any means a purely democratic stance, that all lives are valuable inherently. And with that, I want to, so that's my somewhere for that, and I want to thank you for your time. I'll end my screen share if I can figure out how. There we go. Thank you.
All right, I will thank you all for that. I'm actually gonna, just keeping in mind the continual battle to trying to find the right spot in our house where the internet is best, going to leave my camera off just to make sure that the odds are that you'll be able to hear me. Seeing me is great, hearing me is better. I want to invite anyone who would like to start posting questions. There's a Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom. And Gabby Fiorenza's posting instructions in the chat right now. As questions come in, we will ask them. I wanted to start off by asking all three of you, actually, a question. Just I got the sense that all of you could have talked a great deal about this. You have a lot to say about data in our moment, why people should think about this. Keeping you to like 15, 20 minutes was kind of cruel. And it seems like hypothetically, the public at large would be more primed than ever to engage in these conversations. I think we were talking about this a little bit before, but we are, all of us, kind of suffused in, if not new health data, an awareness of health data in the way that we weren't before. Mercifully, I had no idea what an R naught was a year ago. I had never even thought about my blood oxygenation level. I had never really thought much about the difference, like how vaccine efficacy was calculated. And these are all things that, for better or worse, I know, and a lot of other people know. Dan B, I am one of the readers who now has an awareness and feels like I live in a wave or a curve to an extent that I never thought before. And yet, this is a conversation, it was an English professor and a historian who invited you here. And so this is not surprising that humanists would be having this conversation among ourselves, but I'm curious the extent to which you have seen opportunities to bring your expertise into this wider conversation about where we are. I've seen no shortage of kind of bad takes on these questions, but if you have had opportunities to speak to these questions about our data in our present moment, or would like to see, what would you say? Where would you say it? Where have you said it? These sorts of things. Any of you who would like to speak, I won't take hands or anything like that, but just whoever would like to speak can feel free.
I'll jump in really quickly and then let Joanna say things more substantially. In part because I haven't talked a lot about medical things, in part because the pandemic had a secondary casualty, which was the United States Census, which was taking place during 2020. And between the pandemic's interruption of field activities and the Trump administration's blatant attempts to decrease participation in the census, I've been spending a lot of my time just thinking about what's going to happen to that important source for these baselines that we deal with, this source of data, which has implications for the Electoral College, implications for the way the government operates. And so I spend a lot of time now talking about that, which is, as we have to say, is also a kind of health data that is related to, or that is premised here. And then the other area that's kind of ancillary, but also really important that we haven't talked so much about, Joanna did talk about this a little bit, is artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is one of these fields which is getting a lot of rise, along with the standing desk, out of COVID. And it's often premised on the use of data sets, and often premised on the same kinds of predictive logics that we've been looking at in our histories. And there too, we need to be, I guess, maybe helping to show that there are these longer histories that are built into and premised on, and the long-term ways in which these predictive systems have histories of being inequitable, have histories of not working particularly well, have histories of hiding their reliance on the labor of individuals, as Joanna was talking about.
Yeah, Dan, I agree with everything that Dan said. And I think probably there's so much to be said. And it has brought me no joy as a historian of medicine who studies the emergence of modern epidemiology and some of these kinds of issues to sort of, in some ways, feel like nothing that's happened so far is surprising. It's tragic, but it's not, it's exactly what our kind of histories tell us are going to happen. And one of the things that I feel frustrated about is the sense that there is in the popular imagination that history is for kind of settling bets once the past is past, rather than being a resource for the present. And there's been a lot of chaos around at least the United States effort to deal with the pandemic, let alone the census, let alone any of these other kinds of issues. And in the kind of haste and efforts to kind of get things done, I worry that we're compounding these older problems, right? And so what I would, I guess, what I'm interested in, what I'm actively trying to do from my base in the medical school is try to think about how to have conversations that can allow us to at least get a set of like best practices for thinking about the kinds of data collection that are happening. And so before we can even do that, we need to at least understand what is the kind of current life cycle of a COVID testing sample, or what is, a sample that's collected through COVID testing, or what is the life cycle of, data that's collected through contact tracing. And this isn't to say we can get the full range, but just where are the stops? And I've been imagining a kind of visualization, that just at least allows people to understand that there's this massive backstage, which is where the money's being made, which is where the power is being built. And if we could at least start to understand those steps and connect those issues, then we might be able to solve, not just prevent compounding the current problems, but get to, and I saw a question that just emerged that I think is a huge issue, is the question of mistrust. So being in the med school, I also have had the opportunity to be connecting with a number of different divisions, sections of medical practice, who are now trying to reckon with questions of racial justice in the wake of Black Lives Matter and the kinds of stark inequalities that are being really unavoidably brought to bear through the COVID pandemic. And, it's been remarkable that work that I've been doing for now almost, 20 years, people are kind of rushing around, waving their hands like, what do we do? What do we do? And I'm really interested in trying to help people in this moment, help practitioners who have never been more interested in trying to get beyond the sort of science or biomedical bubbles that they're in, to think about the implications of their practice and what they do. And I think that these questions of health data and health access and invisibility and transparency are really critical for thinking about what it means to have trust. And I'll just give one more little vignette. So in one of the groups I'm in, which is connected to the Department of Infectious Disease Medicine, we were sort of tasked with responding to an op-ed in the New Haven Register by a Black community leader who wrote about why he wouldn't take a vaccine. This is before the Pfizer Moderna announcements, and saying, that it's not, we have this idea of anti-vaxxers being, a certain kind of, white suburban mom, which I might be glossed as one of them. But really, if we look at these kinds of histories of who are the bodies upon which knowledge about, biomedicine and health and illness have been built, we see that we have these stories like the story I told about the Pima, the story that I've told about, a number of different Indigenous communities being asked to give their bodies about Henrietta Lacks, to develop technologies, and then not having even any access to the benefits of those technologies, and often some of the harms. And it's frustrating to me that to see that even many of my humanist colleagues imagine that these questions of trust can be healed just by getting doctors to sort of insist more that vaccines are good. And there seems to be a misrecognition between this sort of false divide between the humanities and the sciences, that each imagines that the other side, can just do things relatively easily, and why don't they? And I think, for those of us on the panel who I think each of us sit at this an interesting different node, but that or nexus of humanities and sciences, we see that the sort of misunderstandings there. And I get frustrated because I feel like I can see so many possibilities for very basic kinds of efforts at building trust, but it can't happen until we start to talk to each other. And that's why I'm grateful for an opportunity like this, just to even outline what some of the problems are. So I'm distracted by some of the questions, but I do feel like, just understanding very basically how our data infrastructures are working right now can go a long way toward not compounding problems in the future, not undermining whatever gains science and medicine may be able to make in providing respite in the context of the pandemic.
I'll just add, thinking about the humanities and numbers, this year we have been pummeled by numbers and new numbers that we had never considered before, like R naught, and just the shocking numbers out of the COVID tracking project and other places. But also, as Joanna and Dan have pointed out, it's also I think we've never been more alienated or also confused by numbers. I mean, human beings aren't good at numeracy and understanding how to sort of translate these things. And I think the humanities provides us a way to sort of think about this data that's both hidden and surfaced, and how to translate that into understandable narratives that people actually much more associate with, rather than just these strange numbers that they hear about. And so I think the union of this data and some sort of understanding making through the process of the humanities has never become more critical. I mean, Joanna and Dan in his presentation to bring up the curve idea. We've relied on essentially data visualization to get us through the year as our bridge between humanity and these strange data sources that we don't really understand. And I don't know that that has been effective or ethical. I mean, I think there's all kinds of problems that then get hidden in the data itself, get visualized without a real understanding of what's going on. And so I wonder if some reassertion of the power of narrative and humanities understanding will become even more critical in this age of big data.
I think that's so beautifully put, Dan, because I think a lot about, the kinds of expertise that have seemed to have been most valued right now are economics and epidemiology, which are sort of two of the more quantitative forms of knowledge making, but they're also two of the most speculative forms of knowledge making. And this is where I think, I agree that the humanities have something to bring in trying to understand where these forms of speculation come from, what is informing a sense of what the variables are. This is where I love Dan's formula. Like what if we could understand like what factors are going into a particular kind of curve or particular set of epidemiological predictions, then we would be better able to understand what the data is telling us and what it can't tell us. And I think that data as it comes to us, or these data representations as they come to us, tend to be like indiscriminate. Like it's very difficult to tell one from the other. And so I think the same way we have been seeing this very interesting shift to reporting on disinformation, just way too late, too little, too late. But seeing, Instagram and Facebook and whatever sort of trying to put a stopgap in, there are ways in which we might ask our reporters, I think there's work to be done there, our reporters to report on how they got the story, or to report on how the data was made, not just what the data is. And I think that this is something that the humanities, or a humanistic approach to health data and health data sciences, can really go a long way. And there may be a role to be played of actually interfacing not just between the humanities and the sciences, but interfacing with those people who are responsible for bringing the data to the broader public, helping them to figure out that it's possible to say things about the limitations of data that don't make them be anti-science. And I think that's a real concern of people in media, that if they say something about the data being incomplete or limited or whatever, that somehow they're anti-science. And I think we need a different kind of position, one that I don't actually think is insurmountable, but someone needs to be able to do that work. And I think humanists are really well positioned to do that.
Yeah, if I could just add one more thing there, the nice thing to think about these is we don't have to draw very strong distinctions between numbers and humanities, or between stories and numbers. Because numbers have always been rhetorical tools, have always been things that people have spoken with. And one of the, I think, they're also deeply effective as well, right? Like all of the tools of humanities should be and must be employed in quantification, such that we can't have a distinction between those who talk about numbers being anti-science or pro-science or whatever. The scientists and the humanists are engaged in a lot of the same knowledge practices, just often from slightly different vantage points. But I mean, there's great work on the kind of effective life of numbers coming out. So Jackie Wernement has done this, Theo Dreyer, Michelle Murphy, Caitlin Zaloom does this. But I mean, you don't need scholars even. Like, think about election night and election week. and like the refresh, or our experience of COVID tracker, of all those things, refresh. Like no one needs to be convinced any longer that there's a deep effective power to data, and that it isn't about like empathy at the bedside versus dry data. Like that was an illusion the whole time.
I just wanted to jump in, if it's all right, to the, because I think that the use of the wave metaphor and wave visualization has been so powerful. And I just wanted to plug actually that David Jones and I'm going to forget his first name, but Helmreich is his collaborator's name. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I thought, but I just was, I didn't want to get it wrong. Wrote a great piece in the Boston Review, if people are interested, on the shape of epidemics and thinking about the long history of the wave. And something that I wanted to add that I've been thinking a bit about is also those, and this speaks, I think, Joanna, to your point about what data and those visualizations capture and what they don't capture. You know, one thing that seems really important is that insofar as the major forms of representation are about infection and death, especially as long haulers have been sort of moving to the fore, there is this question about long-term effects, about long-term disability, as well as what Jasbir Puar might call debility. So the sort of structurally disabling features of the pandemic that are just erased, I think, by those metaphors of waves.
Yeah, and I might just add on that question of long haulers, it's a great way to be thinking about, whose data, what is your sample getting used for? So you give a COVID sample, maybe back in March if you had COVID, and now here it is November and you're still struggling with symptoms, you don't necessarily have control over the way in which, your sample is going to be used to ask questions. And what I'd love to see are more attention to people that are living living with the aftermath of COVID, getting to help shape research agendas about what's going to be done. And I'm suspicious, or I'm doubtful that those voices are actually the ones driving the way that these biomaterials are being used. And I also just wanted to say something about kind of non-knowledge or agnotology and what we don't know. I mean, for me as a historian, the very first time I went into an archive, I was overwhelmed by the fact that I didn't even know what wasn't there. And I was like, how am I supposed to write something out of an archive when I don't even know what didn't make it in? And so that, I think, really activated my imagination about how do I situate myself? How do I situate, what it is that I'm trying to do? And one of the things that I think humanists are really good at doing is trying to think about what we maybe can't know or don't know, and historians in particular have some sense of what could have been done or what could be otherwise. And that's that way in which history is a resource for the present, of imagining alternative possibilities of how we want to live with our machines, with our knowledge. And Dan's amazing point that doesn't have to be a distinction between, knowing and feeling, but we should be paying attention to how do we feel about what we know and what we don't know. And do we even know what we feel, which sometimes we don't.
Do you all see, you've all in some ways brought up this question of the access to a lot of the information, the fact that a lot of the visualizations, a lot of the data being produced is either proprietary or black boxed or whatever question there is. I, for example, have obsessed is maybe too strong. I've become really fascinated by the Kinza health weather. I don't know if you've seen this. It's this, anyone who uses a smart thermometer, the data goes into this thing, and then there's a weather map of where 2 weeks in the future you might expect COVID to pop up. And it is full of blinking lights, color codes. It's this kind of confusing mess of ways of saying, look out, without any sense of what's going on behind the scenes, or the fact that only certain people can afford or would use $100 smart thermometer in certain regions. And so there is this kind of performance of how much they know without really any sense of the either the certainty or how much that will be stored. And that just, I think of that as an example of like what as historians do we want stored there? Or how are these sorts of things being preserved? Or are these even are these epiphenomenon where actually we will have access to public health data and these sorts of things that will allow us to do the history of this moment in 10, 20, 30 years?
I have like a lot of answers, and I just wanted to kind of tie that question to one of Ashley Brown's question about distrust of data, but a kind of contradictory immersion in technology, because I think there's something maybe connected to what you're saying there. And here's where, rather than having to predict the future, I think we have some real object lessons in looking at the history of genomics in the last 50 years or even the last 20 years. And I think that I tend to be rather cynical in my answer. If you look at all the people that have done things like 23andMe or given their data for genetic ancestry tests and wanting to
We can't quite hear you first.
It got muffled and then it went away.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm sitting in a strange position to avoid the sun, which is invading my office space. Just to say that we don't have access to that information, to answer Chris's question, because it's all privately. We paid to give it away, basically. We paid a premium to give our data to companies that are now doing whatever they want with it, and maybe doing things that we don't feel good about, but we don't actually know. And so I think, to Ashley's question, there is a good reason to feel mistrustful of the data, and also to feel like there isn't necessarily a way out. And I kind of am sympathetic to that position, because we can't, in this way, there's a certain amount of refusal that's not possible. We can't just completely unplug, especially now that we've been even more enrolled in these online regimes, and that's our way of connecting. But I guess what I would say to someone like Ashley, and what I say to my students, is let's use this as an opportunity to learn about the systems into which we're being interpolated. That's the lesson. Like, that's the curriculum. And that's what I'd really like to see, rather than kind of imagining there'll be some future time where the data that exists will be useful, for asking questions about the present that will be the past. Let's try to intervene and understand the ways in which we're being interpolated right now, and use these historical cases as a guide about where to look and where the pressure points might be.
I think it's really critical to make your own archive in the digital age. So much stuff is going to be lost. We have to actually be involved in creating the kinds of ethical and complete data sets that we would want ourselves to have in decades in the future, centuries in the future. I think one of the neat things, just thinking about Ashley's question, is if you look at the COVID-19 tracking project, which has become the de facto data source, it is more or less staffed by humanities scholars. Amanda French, who is one of the early volunteers, came out of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media, where I worked with her for years. She has a PhD in English. Alexis Madrigal from the Atlantic is a historian of technology who now writes and just wanted to start this. So these are people with really deep backgrounds in the topics we've discussed over the last hour and a half, who want to see a properly created database, not just for the present, but for the future. And I think having folks who are in the humanities understand what's under the hood, understand how data is made, understanding things like metadata, understanding where archives have gaps in them. And Joanna's very good point, which I've experienced as well, of understanding what's there and what's not there. All of that stuff in the digital age has to be sort of footnoted and described in the present, because you just simply lose access to any of the context as it gets separated out. So I think we sort of have to do it ourselves.
I'll add one more thing. I know we're maybe getting close to the end, but both Chris's question and Ashley's question, I think one interesting way to frame questions of trust is about the uses of distrust. Who is putting distrust to use and in what way? and this is also a way of speaking to Joanna, talking about agnotology and what we know and don't know. There are good and bad uses of agnotology. So whenever one puts together a major data set, one occludes some things, right? Like you pick the variables that matter and you only show those variables, and everything else you don't show. And that's a kind of agnotology. You put some things in the archive and some things you don't put in there. And that's necessary in order for scholarship to work. But then you have to start thinking about the principles guiding that collection behind those variables, right? Like I was grimacing at the idea of this health weather thing, because while I believe it might show us where some people are getting sick, it doesn't seem like it'll help anyone be convinced they should cancel rent. And like that for me is the way in which the health data and the curves can sometimes prevent us from thinking about other kinds of frameworks. That by creating purely health data, it can stop you from thinking about the political and economic systems that are also connected to health. And so that kind of occlusion can be a problem. But then the other point and problem is that distrust in data. Well, we want to cultivate it in some ways. We want some healthy skepticism. Is also often weaponized. And we've seen over the last half century how it's been weaponized by corporations, whether it's tobacco companies or now climate change fossil fuel companies. And now we see it by the ruling administration in the United States is weaponizing distrust for its own gain. So we want to be careful that while we are distrustful, that we're not allowing our distrust to be used against us and against the interests of vulnerable people.
So I know Dan Cohen has to leave for another dance happening at 1:30. So I will actually just wrap this up with, I think, a question that would be particularly appropriate for Dan B and Joanna. These questions, actually, a number of people have asked more about these collections of who is targeted for data gathering and how informed consent works with those populations. So I'll thank Dan Cohen, because I know he has to leave, and send us off with this question. I'll actually read them. One question is, ads for genetic analysis target diaspora populations, Jews and African Americans, what to make of that? And this other question, that is such a huge question. How do we reckon with current day notions of informed consent for the reuse of historical data in today's scientific landscape?
I mean, these are really amazing, big questions that I am deeply involved in. And I guess what I would say to the first question about connecting from diasporic populations is a really interesting phenomenon, because one of in my book, In Life on Ice, I was looking at scientists who were focusing on populations that they saw as explicitly non-diasporic. They wanted to look at indigenous communities who they understood as being kind of fixed in place and closer to nature and close to the land. And it was against those bodies that more cosmopolitan people were going to be able to ask to know themselves or compared to know themselves. And so if I had to hazard a guess, this shift, and there's a lot of subtleties here, but the shift towards diasporic populations is recognizing that there are now opportunities to broaden and expand the kinds of knowledge that is possible to make. So I keep thinking, kind of picking on 23andMe, but this idea was that initially, the data from people who were admixed or were not seen as these indigenous communities wasn't supposed to be as valuable. But once they had massive collections of millions of samples, they started to be able to recognize patterns, and they were able to do a certain new kind of hypothesis generation from these data sets. And I think there's been a recognition that diasporic populations in particular, talking for a minute about African Americans, there are lots of interest in marketing medicines to those communities. So, for example, Bidil, this drug that was FDA approved, a blood pressure drug, I think it was a hypertension drug, in particular for African Americans. So there's this interest in trying to target those populations, learn about those populations, recognize them as having important, being important for markets and market share. But then if you look at questions around Jews have been long studied in terms of genetics. The reason we have certain kinds of tests like for Tay-Sachs and other things are precisely because of those issues. And I'm sort of fumbling around because there's so much I want to say, but what I guess I should do is say, read Keith Waylu's work on this subject, because he's looked in particular at Jews, at African Americans as targets for genetic knowledge making. And I think that there's a lot to say there. I also think in terms of informed consent and these collections, informed consent doesn't really work as a technology, and we need to revisit it. And we need to have some important conversations about what this means, especially when we're dealing with longitudinal collections or samples being reused. How do you ask permission to use a sample for someone that is dead? You know, and what does that mean? So these are questions that, you know, I can't say I have a solution, but I think that we haven't done enough to recognize that there's a problem. There are scholars that have absolutely identified this as a problem, but I think the status quo is still that you know, informed consent is a workable technology. Even as scientists continue to be astounded and surprised when people push back. They're like, but I got the informed consent. And so this could be a whole other discussion. And I guess when I say like, this is what the curriculum is, like these are ways of really trying to examine what actually happens when these bits of data move through these infrastructures, and that will give us a way to understand the limitations of the approaches we've had, and to try to reckon with why people feel aggrieved, you know, when they can see themselves as following the letter of the law. But is the law, are the rules, are the protocols actually serving, who are they serving? And I think that's really a big question that needs to be asked. So a lot to be said, not a lot of time to say it.
I'll very briefly add on to that. Alondra Nelson's book, The Social Life of DNA, is a great study that thinks like about how people are both constructing social identities, transnational ties through these kinds of tests, and then also engaging in politics around things like reparations. Yeah, thank you, Dan. Really nice having you here. And then Joanna already mentioned Tim Tallbear's book, but there's an example of a scholar explicitly saying, I'm going to study the folks who did the studying, not those who were studied, so as not to reuse or re-objectify people who have been objectified by science in the past. And this is an interesting thing for us as historians to think about too, since often our historical work is dealing with people who have been objectified in our historical work, thinking about the way we direct our analysis as to who will be objectified by our analyses as we try to think through this historical moment.
On that note, I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and this has just been really fantastic. So thank you so much. Sarah, did you want to say something?
Oh yeah, I just also wanted to say, I noted in the participants as well that some other people who have done some really foundational work on digital health humanities showed up. I saw Olivia Banner, and it's just been great to be able to have this conversation with all of you. So thank you so much, and it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.